Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. In this video I'll be discussing Dr. No, Ian Fleming's sixth James Bond novel from 1958, and picking up directly after the cliffhanger ending of the previous book, From Russia with Love, released in 1957. Now, when looking at Fleming's Bond novels, they typically fall into two different camps. The more out-and-out pulp action novels, of which Dr. No and Live and Let Die are the best examples, and then the more literary-minded books that try to work in other elements or go in other directions and aren't always as pure out-and-out action-oriented. There's also a sort of dividing line around this time period, if you're looking at the Bond novels in the order in which they were written and published, that after From Russia with Love and Dr. No, that Fleming really started trying to experiment more and try different things and added more introspection throughout the novels, starting with Goldfinger. So around this point in reading the books in chronological order, you can start to feel that there are shifts away from the more pulpy flavor with the Fleming sweep at its purest and most direct in terms of the narrative drive. So again, Dr. No is alongside Live and Let Die as the most action-adventure, pulp-oriented of all the James Bond novels, and it wears this on its sleeve by being an unabashed tribute in ways to the works of pulp fiction that Ian Fleming grew up on, most notably Sax Rohmer's Fu Manchu novels. Dr. No is very clearly inspired by Fu Manchu, which has led a lot of literary critics and other people to write the book and the character off as merely a cheap knockoff of Fu Manchu and containing a lot of the same inherent racism of those stories. But I do think it does the novel and Fleming's creation a disservice, as while the whole Dr. No character and story is very obviously inspired by Sax Rohmer, it's done in Fleming's own style. It's not just regurgitation, and it's also quite down-to-earth and believable when you get past the more fantastical, larger-than-life elements that Fleming brought to any Bond story. At each novel's core is a story that just is plausible enough, and all the events could technically happen. So it's a book that I think has never quite gotten its due. And also, I think it's important to look at where it comes in terms of being the sixth book in the series, with Fleming having gotten 5 books under his belt and recharged his creative batteries on From Russia with Love, and basically just picking up right after that book and jumping into a straightforward pulp adventure in the style that Live and Let Die had. It's a very focused and driven book. There's not so much of having to unravel multiple plot threads to get to the final conclusion. It's pretty clear as the reader is led in from the opening sequence who the actual villain must be and where the final battle is going to take place. And since it takes place in Jamaica, it not only echoes Live and Let Die in terms of its flavor and plot type, but it echoes it in terms of characters returning, and also certain sequences and certain elements of the plot structure actually echo Live and Let Die as well. So you do, I think, have to look at the two novels as joined in a number of ways. Not only are they the most action and adventure pulp novels of the James Bond series, but they also share the same primary location, except in Dr. No, the whole book pretty much takes place in Jamaica, whereas Live and Let Die had all the American sections. They echo each other in a number of interesting ways, and it shows how much Fleming has grown as a writer. So as I feel with Live and Let Die, it seems that the more out-and-out action-driven books, the ones that are Fleming's own particular brand of pulp fiction, don't necessarily get the same sort of literary recognition as some of the other novels. It's common to see discussion and praise of Casino Royale and From Russia with Love and On Her Majesty's Secret Service, but you don't see as much discussion given to Live and Let Die and Dr. No, which I think is unfair, but also a sign of how pulp literature and action and adventure fiction doesn't usually have the same sort of critical standing in the literary world, which is quite funny, as actually writing legitimate great adventure fiction that works and is completely unique and has energy to it with great narrative plotting is extraordinarily difficult. And frankly more difficult than other genres when you actually sit down and try to write them. So I do think Dr. No is one of Fleming's most underrated novels, and actually one of his best written novels in terms of just how effortless it is. So the book picks up after the cliffhanger of From Russia with Love, which ended famously with James Bond being poisoned by Rosa Klebb's poison-bladed shoe and collapsing onto the wine-red floor, presumably to his death, from the fast-acting poison of blowfish. So this, of course, takes place sometime after Bond was able to recuperate, and Fleming invents a just plausible enough sort of situation that's explained away by Sir James Maloney, the doctor in charge of Bond's care, who has a scene with M, essentially asking for Bond to not immediately put back into a stressful situation, which doesn't put M in a very good mood, that his best agent screwed up on his last case and almost got killed, and now it has to essentially take it easy. And so Bond winds up having a sort of chip on his shoulder throughout the first and second acts of the book, that he is essentially being given an assignment in Jamaica that's a supposedly lighter one, and being told that he has to take it easy, which of course earns M's wrath in a way that makes Bond feel a bit embarrassed, but also frustrated and angry at M for being treated in this way due to the events at the ending of From Russia with Love. So it's a nice picking up of where that cliffhanger left the reader, and of course back in the 50s you had to wait a whole year to figure out what exactly would have happened, or if Bond indeed did die at the end of From Russia with Love. It was not truly seemingly considered as the series end, and it seems quite obvious that Fleming was already cooking up how he was going to bring Bond back, so it is at least explained away in a proper sounding story that does at least make sense, even if it is a bit coincidental that Mathis, Bond's friend and ally, was able to call a doctor who just so happened to know how to address curare poisoning, which had basically the same symptoms, and that's what kept Bond alive long enough to then be properly treated. So again, it's just plausible enough. And then this leads into the changing of weaponry, which gives us finally Bond's famous Walther PPK to replace the Beretta .25. This was done at the behest of Geoffrey Boothroyd, who was a firearms expert and a fan of the novels, and famously wrote to Fleming saying, "I love your books, but why do you have Bond using such a puny handgun? It doesn't make any sense." So Fleming took this in stride and took Boothroyd's advice, and thus we have the famous scene in M's office where Bond is given his Walther PPK, but also, as we see time and again in the novels, Bond has a second piece of weaponry done for more heavy artillery or long-range work. And here he's given a Smith & Wesson revolver, but Fleming apparently goofed in the descriptions and described a weapon that doesn't exactly exist. But this is sort of picking up the place of the long-barreled revolver that Bond would sometimes keep in his Bentley, and we'll see this on and off again through the novels, that Bond will have the typical handgun be the Walther PPK from this point onward, and then have something for heavier long-range work, or the heavy artillery piece that will either be kept in the car or used in certain situations. We also see an appearance by the Chief of Staff for the first major time, but he's not named yet. This is, of course, Bond's greatest friend in the service, Bill Tanner, who will eventually be named and become a recurring presence, but here he's simply still known as the Chief of Staff. In terms of Bond's character and where he is at this point, he is still reeling from not only almost being killed after the events of From Russia with Love, but the long recuperation process overseen by the neurologist Sir James Maloney, who will also be a recurring character. So he's not back up to speed 100%. He's obviously recovered enough to be put back into active service, but he knows he messed up in terms of how his last assignment ended. M is not letting him forget it anytime soon, and he is now faced with the sort of double humiliation of being given what is seemingly a simple assignment to just send him off somewhere, and also being deprived of his primary weaponry, which he lovingly took care of, the .25 Beretta, throughout the past 5 novels. So again, this gives Bond a chip on his shoulder throughout the story until we really get to the final act on Crab Key. Essentially, Bond has something to prove at the start and the second act of the book, where he wants to get this assignment over and done with, to get back up to speed and show M that he's fighting fit and can take anything that M can throw at him. So it does provide a nice different sort of tack for the character, and also dealing with the aftermath of the ending of the previous book and the sort of baggage that is associated with messing up and then almost dying and then having to have a long recuperation period. Now, to talk about the plot, we open with essentially the setup, the examination, and the explanation of the Office of the British Secret Service in Jamaica, which is run by Commander Strangways, who was previously seen in Live and Let Die, the novel. This is, of course, where we see Strangways at his usual game of bridge and being called away for his assigned radio meeting with London to exchange information, and having to drive back so he's not late. But of course, he has the same routine every day, and this has been observed by the efficient machinery in place. And so Strangways and his secretary Mary Trueblood are eliminated by the assassins known as the Three Blind Mice, and then the house, and thus the entire station of the British Secret Service in Jamaica, is systematically destroyed by fire, and no trace is left of the two individuals. And so it's left to MI6 to figure out what happened to their efficient Jamaican station that suddenly is a pile of ashes, presumably with Strangways and his secretary having run off together. It's a extraordinarily striking opening that automatically sets the level of suspense for the reader for the rest of the story, because we know that not only is the villain behind these actions extraordinarily cautious and careful, but they have covered their tracks almost perfectly and made the entire destruction of the British Secret Service station and personnel for Jamaica look as if it was a series of mundane events that have to be investigated, but the investigation will come up with the predetermined fate that has been laid in place with the evidence that has essentially been manufactured. So this is the case that Bond is sent out on. He's essentially sent to Jamaica to figure out what happened to Strangways, although it seems obvious to everyone involved that Strangways simply had gotten fed up with his job and run off with his beautiful new secretary, leaving no trace. And so Bond is sent to Jamaica ostensibly to run a few leads to ground and complete some paperwork and come back after a time. And so to Bond, it's an insulting paid holiday, treating him as if he has to take it easy further, and once again reminding everyone of his failure at the end of From Russia with Love that almost cost him his life. Of course, the reader knows better due to the fantastic opening sequence that has started the level of suspense that only rises and grows as Bond finds in his investigation and just looking around Jamaica that things don't quite add up, and he's the one who is actually asking the necessary questions, which earns several more attempts on his life by the various factions who want to know more about this operative and seemingly find out everything about him, right down to exactly when he's arriving at the airport, due to apparently having a source in a government house. As soon as Bond arrives in Jamaica, he reteams with Quarrel from Live and Let Die, so Quarrel becomes the major secondary character through the rest of the book and is just as much of a delight as he was in Live and Let Die. He is essentially Bond's point man and also informs him of all local activities and is his sort of guide around aspects and areas of Jamaica, in addition to getting Bond trained up and prepared for their eventual adventure of sneaking onto Crab Key and investigating the guano factory of Dr. No. What leads them to Crab Key is the only thing that Strangways was apparently working on at the time of his disappearance, which was a case for the Audubon Society about the preserve they had established for the endangered bird species, the roseate spoonbill, complete with a pair of wardens who lived on the island of Crab Key to watch over these rare birds. But for some strange reason, suddenly their entire camp was destroyed and burned to the ground, with all the birds either dead or having flown away in terror, and only one of the wardens surviving after being horribly burned long enough to essentially speak gibberish before dying. So this is what Strangways had been working on at the request of the Audubon Society in America. Again, it's a classical sort of beautiful Fleming pulpy touch of having something that is so seemingly mundane that it couldn't possibly be anything that was dangerous or nefarious or larger than life. But in a James Bond novel, there's always something lurking underneath the surface. And so this, of course, is what led to Strangways eventually being killed off by asking too many questions about the seemingly small matter of what appeared to be some wardens who eventually went stir-crazy from living on an island watching after some birds who suddenly flew away. The rest of the island is owned by a strange Dr. No, who runs a guano factory, which is given a great deal of background and description, and is actually quite fascinating because it explains how Dr. No was a brilliant individual who purchased this island and started this guano factory many years beforehand to corner a portion of the guano market, which is extraordinarily profitable. And so while it is still obviously cultivating bird dung, it is extraordinarily profitable as it is used as a fantastic fertilizer. And so Dr. No makes millions of dollars per year in 1950s money simply by applying his own intellect and foresight into essentially mining bird poop. Tensions continue to mount as Bond continues to ask questions in Jamaica, and over a series of events, several attempts are made to first learn more information about him, and then several attempts are made on his life, most famously in his bed at the hotel that he's staying in. This is one of the most iconic and gripping sections of all of Fleming's Bond novels, and the reason why Dr. No is the one book in the series you don't want to read while you're in bed about to go to sleep, because of course Bond finds his bedmate is none other than a tropical centipede whose bite can kill a man, and Fleming takes this opportunity to not waste a single word in gleefully describing how Bond has to find superhuman reserves to not move and not breathe as the poisonous, deadly tropical centipede takes its time crawling all over his naked body. It's one of the great moments of suspense in the entire series. And again, don't read this passage when you're going to bed, because then you'll be awake the rest of the night thinking that there's a centipede in your bed somewhere. Various bits of information and the attempts on Bond's life all seem to point towards the mysterious Dr. No character being behind them, and of course being so shrouded in mystery that he uses his agents in Jamaica to try and gather information about Bond, from the information in his files to getting photographs of him and having more information relayed after multiple attempts on his life fail. All Bond really knows is that Dr. No is Chinese, which links further to the various individuals who are part of this sort of organization of agents throughout Jamaica that are involved in these attempts on Bond's life, or to prevent him from finding out what happened to Strangways, who are all either African Chinese or Chinese themselves, which is a classical sort of pulp fiction trope of having a villainous sort of network of agents of various capacities operating for an unseen villain figure within certain cultures or certain sections of a city. It's something you'll see pop up throughout pulp fiction, and something that's in the Fu Manchu novels that Fleming grew up on. And so this is another element that is very much a tip of the hat to classical pulp fiction. Some will call this inherent racism, which has been discussed many times in terms of this overall trope, or spinning certain elements into a fictional territory by inventing a sort of mythical section of a city or metropolis that doesn't quite exist. For example, throughout pulp fiction, every time there's a story that involves skullduggery and mystery in Chinatown, there are usually secret groups or back alleys or secret gangs that operate almost in a sort of larger than life way, which obviously is not very realistic and is definitely over dramatizing it, but it's that sort of trope. I don't mind that. I understand why people might apply certain labels or feel that way about it, but here I think Fleming does manage to distinguish that Dr. No, like Mr. Big before him in Live and Let Die, uses his influence and power over others to make them do his bidding, because he's an excellent reader of psychology and is, several steps ahead of everyone else, and is thus able to exercise his influence and control over a great variety of others. But it's, again, a classical pulp fiction conceit of having the secret network of agents who are all typically of either one locale or one ethnicity. Bond and Quarrel decide they're going to invade the island fortress of Dr. No and see what they can uncover on the island of Crab Key, which all of the local fishermen and anyone else steers clear of, as the island has a bad reputation, and anyone who goes around it is usually never heard from again, even though all it supposedly is a guano factory with essentially a on-island living private army who operates the machinery and keeps the factory going, and Dr. No himself is never seen. After a daring attempt to land at night, which is successful, Bond awakes the next morning to find himself stunned by the sight of Honey Ryder, who is on the beach gathering shells and standing there beautifully naked, which is one of Fleming's most strikingly erotic moments in the series. She is described in a very sort of classical pulp way herself as essentially a sort of female Tarzan, a girl who grew up actually very near the house where Bond and Quarrel are staying, and lost her father and her nanny who had been taking care of her, and then essentially grew up among nature on her own, with her only education being a volume of encyclopedias that she's been poring over all these years. And quite nicely, Honey actually manages to assist Bond and Quarrel as they're all sort of now stuck in this predicament. She usually sneaks onto the island to gather seashells, which she sells to make her living, but now that Bond and Quarrel are there, the forces of Dr. No are out in full formation, out to get them, which takes the form of course, a machine gun placed on a boat that circles around the beach and fires at them, the guards going through the swamps with dogs hunting for their scent, and then, of course, the famous dragon that is described, that Bond tries to laugh off as being too ridiculous, but, of course, there is a particular sort of vehicle designed to frighten the locals and natives that even has the ability to breathe fire. Once Bond and Honey are captured and taken into the fortress of Dr. No, this is where we step over more into the full pulp fantasy realm, as we are then given the inner workings of the guano factory, which actually is an entire secret facility built into the side of the mountain, culminating in the fantastical, perfect hotel rooms of sorts, a sort of mink-lined prison that Bond and Honey are put into for observation. Then they finally meet the fantastic Dr. No himself in his great dining hall sanctum with the entire glass wall built into the side of the ocean deep down, giving the Doctor his own private aquarium that, of course, is the entire ocean itself. Dr. No is one of Fleming's great villain characters. He is larger than life. He is obviously very inspired by Fu Manchu, but that wasn't enough for Fleming, who had to describe him in such a unique, striking way that it immediately burns itself into the reader's mind. That this figure looks inhuman in ways in terms of he moves with a sort of worm-like grace and, of course, has no hands. Instead, he has steel pincers. His backstory is absolutely fascinating, going back to his ancestry and then working from and stealing from a Tong society, which was used to fund his transformation and the first of his criminal enterprises, which are now operating here in his secret island base on Crab Key, with the ultimate goal to topple and affect U.S. missiles and military operations. Currently, he is working for the Soviet government, so this ties in to Bond's continual enemy of SMERSH, although indirectly. It's something that's not exactly expected, and so it's surprise after surprise after surprise that gives Bond a greater sense of the stakes he's actually playing for in an assignment that was just supposed to be, almost like 2 weeks in the sun, just to do some paperwork after looking at the site of the burned house of Strangways. So it's got the nice little ironic twist of Bond at one point, thinking about, this was just supposed to be a simple assignment. One would think, what would M make of all of this? What would his face look like if he saw what Bond was having to do? Dr. No is, of course, a brilliant scientist and not content to simply wine and dine Bond and Honey to study this man who has thwarted his organization so many times. He decides to put him into his newly constructed obstacle course to test the threshold of the pain limits and endurance limits that a man can have. And so Bond must use anything he can get his hands on and all of his wits to survive and finally defeat Dr. No, all the while worrying about the terrible fate that will befall Honey Ryder as she is tied down on a beach to face the running of the crabs and be devoured to death. Bond himself has to go through the terrible obstacle course where he is constantly studied in a rather creepy way by various individuals jotting down on clipboards and looking through portholes. This is where he has to crawl through the series of pipes and face everything from being burned alive to an entire nest of tarantulas to eventually culminating in what may be the most over-the-top pulpy moment of the entire series, but is just plausible enough to actually still work. And it's also absolutely terrifying when you think about what that would be like in terms of the experience. And that is the finale of the obstacle course, which culminates with Bond being dumped out basically half alive by this point, and just a physical wreck of bruises and cuts and bleeding all over. He is dumped out into a sectioned off water area where he has to do battle with a giant squid, with nothing but his fists and the few bits of materials he's been able to steal and cobble together into makeshift weapons. Now, to discuss Dr. No himself a bit more as a villain, obviously Dr. No is directly patterned on Sax Rohmer's iconic Fu Manchu character. However, what Fleming does with Dr. No, in addition to giving him a backstory and a complete rationale and a fascinating physical description, is that we actually get an entire history of this character, so we feel like we've experienced their life events. And the strange, exotic appearance he has is entirely his own doing through various events that happened to him, the explanation of the loss of his hands, his explanation of how he went through multiple plastic surgeries when that was not something typically done, to change his appearance entirely, how he obtained his various doctorates, and this actually gives us the psychology of the character and explains just how cold, brilliant, and calculating this individual is. It's one of Fleming's most striking and best villains, and it's also fascinating that he has so little time in the book. Part of what makes the character so striking is that the reader has the suspense built from the very start and the continual mention of the character's name, who we know nothing about, except that they're really dangerous and they're behind all of these attempts to kill Bond and successfully killed Strangways and have been the villain of the entire piece. So we have been waiting to the actual point of the dinner scene to actually encounter this villain. And so that suspense adds to the impact of his final appearance and then getting the whole character's backstory. So it essentially increases the reader's fascination with the character. And while Dr. No is very much a Fu Manchu type character, it's done in a way that is entirely Fleming's own. It's a tip of the hat to Sax Rohmer, of course, but Fleming wasn't just going to regurgitate one of the most famous villains in pop culture, and he was going to do it his own particular way, and it wasn't going to be something that was typical in any way. Fleming was really incapable of doing that. That's what makes the Bond novels so unique, that he had such an ability to craft moments, characters, and descriptions that had that necessary larger-than-life quality that's crucial to any adventure story. Of course, the final fate of Dr. No is not the prettiest one and is not what is seen in the film version. It's one of those moments that when you read a book for the first time, it does take the reader aback a little bit just due to the entire premise of the scenario. And I'll put a spoiler tag if you don't want to know the actual fate of Dr. No if you haven't read the book before. But essentially, Bond barely survives and manages to dispatch Dr. No, who is overseeing the loading of a cargo freighter with fresh guano. And so Bond is able to essentially bury Dr. No alive in his own guano. So it's one of those moments that just due to the thought of somebody being buried in bird crap is it's definitely a weird moment. But then when you actually stop and think about what that would be like just to see, let alone being buried alive in bird guano, it's not a pleasant thought. So it's definitely ironic and poetic justice in a way that he's buried and killed by the very thing that made him all of his money. So it's fitting in a way, but it definitely is one of those moments that the first time you read this, it kind of may throw you just a teensy bit just to think that it's a giant mountain of guano he's buried in. For the heroine, we of course have Honey Ryder, or Honeyshile Ryder as her full name is. Her backstory is tragic and touching in a way that she was an orphan who was raised by the surviving nanny who worked for her parents, and then once her nanny died, she was on her own essentially and became obsessed with learning about nature and essentially interacted with animals and insects and didn't really interact with people outside of the encyclopedia volumes that she studied voraciously. This gives her a sort of nature girl aesthetic and intensive knowledge of the natural world, and is why she goes to Crab Key to gather seashells deep on the sea floor to then sell for money. The other thing is, of course, her famously broken nose, which she tells Bond is due to a man who did take advantage of her and broke her nose when she struggled. And then just to show her mettle, her means of getting back at the man was, of course, killing her rapist with a black widow spider and then watching for days, if not a week, as he died horribly. This very quickly tells Bond and the reader that this girl is not to be underestimated, and despite her seeming lack of knowledge in terms of the civilized world, she is a fully formed person in character and knows, of course, far more about the natural world than Bond does. She also proves her mettle even further by not only leading Bond and Quarrel further into Crab Key and keeping them away from Dr. No's guards, but she actually saves them both and helps Bond out many times and saves Bond even in ways. So she is not a damsel in distress, Although, rather interestingly, Bond does feel very protective towards her. He knows that in certain aspects of this story and the events that happen, obviously she could be overwhelmed or frightened or not know what to make of it because she doesn't have a fully rounded educational background and had such a sheltered, unique existence. But he also is sort of berating himself because he's obviously attracted to her, especially since the first glimpse he sees is of her naked backside, and then she turns around and is completely naked. But he does feel protective towards her, and he feels bad in ways. He actually asks in his internal monologue, he's berating himself, should I even feel attracted to this girl? Is it right? Does she even know enough about the world to be cognizant of being in any sort of relationship? Would that be taking advantage of this person? And also, why am I even thinking about all of this when we're trying to not get killed at any second? So it allows their relationship to start and develop, and it's nice to see Bond, as usual, though he as a character wouldn't really admit it, is at his core still a romantic in ways, and almost always develops deep feelings or falls somewhat in love with the main heroine of the story. But it's fascinating that Honey Ryder as a character could be a cliched character, could be the sort of nature girl, female Tarzan type who is completely unaware of the sort of workings of the outside world and is thus naive and innocent. And, of course she is in certain ways, but in believable ways. And she is not a damsel in distress, and she is willing to take matters into her own hands, even defeating some of Dr. No's own schemes to dispatch her. So she is, I think, actually one of Fleming's most likable heroines, and is able to put Bond in his place multiple times, and that earns the reader's admiration even further. So she is a very admirable character who's quite adorable in ways, in addition to being, her own sort of badass in terms of being the female Tarzan type and being able to handle the natural terrain with her knowledge of the natural world, and being able to fight back in areas, along with the fantastic story of revenge she had against her rapist in her past. So I think the Honey character is another sign of how Dr. No as a novel is playing around with classical pulp adventure conceits, but not ever doing them the way they've been done before, by always adding certain elements, certain tweaks, certain changes. It's as if Fleming decided he was going to sit down and write his version of a pulp story that he might have grown up loving, his version in his own James Bond universe. He wasn't just going to repeat past glories or repeat what other pulp writers of the 30s and 40s would have done. No, this is his version in his Bond universe. And the Honey Ryder character is essentially the ultimate version of this type of heroine character in a pulp story. For the Allies, we primarily have Strangways and Quarrel, who again repeat from Live and Let Die. Strangways is only in the opening of the book, as he's dispatched before Bond ever is put on the case. But Quarrel we get a lot more time with, and so it's essentially more of the wonderful banter with Bond we enjoyed in Live and Let Die, and Quarrel is a fascinating, fully rounded character, and so you could really call Quarrel one of the only other true friends that Bond has in the series, outside of course, Felix Leiter and Kerim Bey. Quarrel is very much taking that sort of Kerim Bey role of being the larger-than-life local character who is Bond's ally and Bond's sort of conduit into the local populace, and his sort of cultural translator in ways. Although Bond loves Jamaica and has been there many times, he's not a local, obviously. And Quarrel being equal to Bond in certain areas and being an ally and friend and being a completely developed character is probably the best example we have as a sort of counter argument to people picking up on the inherent racism that is in the Fleming novels and most literary works of this time period in the 1950s. That at the very least, in 2 books, not just one, because he is a recurring character, we have a black character who is an ally of Bond, who is a friend of Bond, who is an equal in certain areas, who is actually more knowledgeable in certain areas, being a Cayman Islander and being a local and knowing the local terrain and the local culture, and being Bond's guide and his means of actually doing the nighttime insertion into Crab Key by rowboat at night. So I think Quarrel is a very important character for a number of different reasons, and I'm really glad that Fleming brought him back from Live and Let Die. And of course, it would make sense that Bond is returning to Jamaica, so he would obviously look up Quarrel again, and that also gives us that nice sense of series continuity of echoing Bond's past trip to Jamaica. So to summarize, I think Dr. No is actually one of Fleming's best novels. I do tend to prefer the more action and pulp-oriented of Fleming's Bond novels in terms of the 2 sort of distinct styles that emerge. It's not something that every fan looks at, but when you read the novels multiple times over the years, those 2 sort of groups of the books start to emerge, that typically the novels kind of fall into either of the 2 camps. And typically the more action-oriented novels don't get quite as much literary recognition. And then in Dr. No and Live and Let Die, there is the discussion surrounding inherent racism or dated aspects. But in Dr. No, I think it's more the sort of remaining feeling of British colonialism, as Jamaica was still a British territory, but it was about to no longer be a British territory. And so there's a bit of that natural sort of feeling of it still having that sort of British colonial hold over the locals and everyone else having to live with that. That generates that feeling. In addition to the subplot and theme of Dr. No's entire network of operatives and most everybody who works at the guano factory, all either being Chinese or African Chinese in terms of their ethnicity. So there were certain elements that I think people could make that argument in terms of the dated aspects of the book. But also, I would point out that Fleming does actually take a moment for Bond to reflect on how obviously Jamaica was going to very soon declare its independence. And so this was really the last sort of period of it being a British territory. And so very soon, a lot of the sort of environment of the British Jamaica would disappear. And so all of the Britishness in Jamaica would either then integrate more fully or fade away, and the overall island culture had already started to change. So this was very much a time capsule period of time in a country that was about to declare its independence and finally no longer be a British colony. But also I think it's important to look at the actual writing quality itself. In terms of the drive and narrative focus, this may be the most focused and direct of all of the James Bond novels. It's also got the plot that definitely emerges the most quickly, and everything else sort of falls away. We know what the final objective has to be in terms of Bond and Quarrel getting to Crab Key and seeing what they can find out about Dr. No. But through the character development and the set pieces, the reader's interest is never lost. It is Fleming at his absolute best in terms of dramatic tension and maintaining that and adding incredible doses of atmosphere that always keep the reader interested. This is one of the Bond novels that it's almost impossible to put down. Pretty much every Fleming novel is that way. But Dr. No is a Bond novel that's almost supercharged with a pulp energy, in some ways even more so than Live and Let Die. And it's impossible to not continually reflect back on Live and Let Die, as they have similar structures, and they both have sequences in Jamaica, and they have a similar structure of a more direct action-oriented plot to defeat a villain who even has an island that Bond has to infiltrate by water. So there are necessary echoes between the two, but they are not one and the same, which is a very difficult task in and of itself, to return to similar ground a couple books later in a series, but then not make it feel like you're consciously repeating those elements and thus not having originality. Well, this book has originality in spades while paying tribute to all of the great works of pulp fiction that Fleming loved, especially most of all the Fu Manchu novels of Sax Rohmer. It is a book that I enjoy more and more as an adult. It's the one that I think is possibly the most underrated of all of the Bond novels. It's not typically in most discussions when people are talking about the best or the top Bond novels, but I really think it deserves to be up there. I do think there's a sort of inherent, maybe unthinking bias against the more action-oriented and action-driven pulp-flavored novels in the series, as opposed to the ones that are more geared towards being seen as a sort of serious literary work in ways. I think because adventure and pulp fiction isn't really looked at in the same light in the realm of literary criticism, that there's a sort of inherent bias against them, which I think means they don't get quite the same level of focus. And I think Dr. No as a novel is one of Fleming's best written, most confident, and most flawless works. It is a work that just feels effortless. It's a book that could only be done after other books in the series had been done and other things had been tried and other avenues had been gone down. And I think it's feeding off of that sort of recharging of creative batteries that Fleming obviously had on From Russia with Love. It picks up right where From Russia with Love left off and is an absolute thrill ride from start to finish with incredible atmosphere and energy, and I think is easily one of the best in the series and arguably the best of the more action pulp-oriented of the Bond novels. Now to talk about adaptations of the novel, we start with the 1960 classic Daily Express strip that was written and adapted by Peter O'Donnell and, of course, drawn once again by the incredible John McCluskey, who created the iconic rendering of Bond in the more tough and masculine appearance in the comic strips that directly influenced the films. It is a good adaptation that moves rather quickly, but it does make a few little tweaks here and there that actually manage to increase the sort of themes of classic pulp fiction. So it's not as rich and textured, obviously, as Fleming's original novel, and there had to be some considerations for the fact that it was being printed in a newspaper, hence why Honey Ryder is, of course, wearing a bikini when she's introduced. I'll also say that the printing is a bit lighter here compared to the other strips, but that could be simply due to how it was replicated in this omnibus. So we have all the major events from the book replicated, although there are a few interesting little moments. As for some strange reason, Sister Rose and Sister Lily in the Mink Line prison are not Chinese, they're Caucasian. So that was a bit strange, but I don't know if that was just an oversight. But we also have really nice visuals for Dr. No's fortress, especially the aquarium and sort of reception area in Dr. No's study, and of course a really nice version of how Fleming describes Dr. No. It's extraordinarily well done and perfectly fitting the text. We get the full description of the obstacle course, beautifully done in terms of the images. So this basically fits perfectly with all of the visuals I've had in my mind every time I've read the book over the years. And then if you were wondering, we of course have the giant squid battle, which is beautifully done in panel form. So I think this is one of the best visual recreations of a Fleming novel plot. It's just obviously in serialized and very adapted form in daily strips. So you obviously weren't meant to read them one after the other, but you can do so and still enjoy the story. It's just obviously nowhere near as textured due to having to adapt an entire novel into a series of daily newspaper strips. Then, of course, comes the iconic first EON film released in 1962. Dr. No was chosen to adapt as the first film since it had a rather straightforward story and could be done technically at a modest budget, which was all they had, the $1 million smaller budget from United Artists. So instead of doing Thunderball, which was the original plan, they went with Dr. No, which was actually a brilliant choice because in taking a story that was already simple and straightforward, it was easy for an audience to be introduced to the world of James Bond for the first time and to learn about the character and get acclimated to the character. Because for most of Dr. No's plot in both book and film, it plays very much like a detective story. And so it's the lead character's reactions that the audience, whether in book or film, is reacting to and spending time with. So it helps a new audience acclimate to a character by having them essentially follow this character around and come to really like and appreciate this character. So it's a brilliant way to start a film series. And because of the inherent classical pulp elements, it's also something that would be familiar and be straightforward enough to do as a standalone film. However, I do think everyone involved, and especially the writers, were aware of the sort of classical pulp fiction conceits that Fleming was playing around with, and I think they thought, especially Richard Maybaum among them, that some of those were a bit old-fashioned, especially by 1962, and that's definitely something the film series didn't want to be seen as doing. Plus, Maybaum in particular was not a fan of having a sort of old-fashioned feel in his Bond scripts from this point onwards, really. So there are a number of tweaks throughout the film to not only distance it from that sort of old-fashioned pulp flavor and the inherent connection to Fu Manchu, but also moments designed specifically to focus on James Bond to highlight the James Bond character. And this, of course, picks up at the start of the film, which replicates the opening of the book with the killing of Strangways and the elimination of the British Secret Service operations in Jamaica. But then we have this newly created specifically for the film introduction to James Bond, which was also necessary because this was a brand new film series, and most audiences wouldn't know who James Bond was unless they actually read the novels, which hadn't gotten a gigantic audience yet, and most would only be familiar with the Daily Express newspaper strip. So there was a necessary reason to have the famous introduction in Les Ambassadeurs, but it is the first of several scenes and set pieces and subplots that are expressly designed to highlight the nature of the James Bond character and his ability to cut through the narrative and be a sort of aspirational figure in ways. So it's small but incredibly insightful moments like this throughout the film that are really important for establishing all the elements of the film series. Yes, it doesn't have all of the touchstones we come to know and expect in terms of the pre-title sequence hadn't been fully formulated yet. John Barry only worked on the theme, and the score was by Monty Norman, which is primarily dealing with island music. We don't have Desmond Llewellyn in his cue yet, and certain other elements feel maybe a tad rougher or more embryonic in ways, as it is obviously the first film, but that does give it a certain freshness, and it fits perfectly with the type of plot Dr. No has, and the fact that it's taking place primarily in Jamaica and transitions to Crab Key very quickly. Obviously, the budget of the film comes into play in certain areas, most notably in the deletion of the entire obstacle course sequence, and obviously there's no giant squid battle. There is Bond still crawling around in the tunnels. We basically have the setup for the obstacle course, but no real explanation as to what Bond is necessarily doing crawling around and being burned and having the grate that shocks him and stuff. So there's little elements of that sequence, but until you read the book, the actual moment in the film where that occurs isn't fully clear. It just seems that Bond is crawling around the ventilator shafts to escape. So that's the main casualty of the film's lowered budget. But it is made up for in a number of fantastic tweaks to the story that actually heightened the drama. First of all, we have no connection to Smurfs. It's been replaced by Spectre, which would be used as the sort of background player villainous organization throughout the 1960s Eon James Bond films. Of course, they had to be very careful about that, as Spectre was introduced in the Thunderball novel, and that was still tied up in litigation, and and meant another reason why they couldn't do Thunderball as the first film. But apparently they did get away with using Spectre as the background villain in both Dr. No and From Russia with Love before they eventually made Thunderball as a film in 1965. But it is a brilliant change that keeps the films from being less overtly political, which is something they always did, and meant that if they could show the films in Russia, they could actually not make everybody mad by having the Russians actually being the background villain. But it also makes the film feel a bit fresher, a bit more modern. The focus is also, in terms of Dr. No's actual scheme, not just to mess with the U.S. missile program, but it's also messing with the U.S. space program, which had emerged by this point in 1962. And Dr. No is using atomic power and has an entire reactor room and chamber instead of it being essentially a secret base inside of his guano factory. All of the guano element of the story has been removed, along with the story about the birds. Instead, Strangways in the film was looking into mysterious reports and sightings around Crab Key because he was asked as a favor to look into why some strange signals were seeming to originate from the Jamaica area that might be interfering with the rockets at Cape Canaveral. So it's made much more of a legitimate threat from the beginning, and we lose that sort of seemingly mundane element that is probably nothing, but because Bond is tenacious and feels that something is off there and keeps digging at it, that's why he uncovers Dr. No's plot in the first place. So there's a couple little things that are tweaked to sort of modernize the film from the novel, but otherwise it is relatively faithful, as it's only 1962 and adapting a 1958 novel. But there is definitely a feeling of them trying to dial down some of the more overt nods to classical pulp fiction to sort of tame down the sort of old-fashioned flavor. And Dr. No is essentially given a much more dignified demise that is also very suitably dramatic and pure poetic justice. It's one of the great villain deaths in the series. But it must be stressed how phenomenal Joseph Weisman is in the film as Dr. No. Yes, he is obviously not of Chinese origin and is given a form of what is termed yellow face makeup in terms of makeup and eyepieces to change the facial appearance. But the reason why I've never had a problem with the film version of Dr. No for that is that this is a character who went through multiple plastic surgery operations over the years to not necessarily look Chinese or like any sort of identifiable person anymore in order to reinvent himself. So the sort of strange look that he has in the film is actually fitting the character. It's not exactly as Fleming wrote the character in the novel, and instead of steel pincers, Dr. No has mechanical hands, which are actually more striking in ways because that was still something that was not commonly seen in 1962 and has a particular mysterious menace as opposed to simply being big steel pincers. But the level of calm, menacing detachment that Weisman has in his few scenes in the film, in addition to a very contained, almost stiffness in terms of his physical movements, actually recreates a lot of the otherworldly quality that Fleming describes in terms of the character, and makes each and every scene he's in the film, which again is not very much because the film builds up to the reveal of Dr. No, it makes each scene all the more important. And the back and forth between Weisman's Dr. No and Sean Connery's James Bond at the dinner table during the dinner scene, with, of course, the aquarium running in the background, is, I think, the best Bond and main villain have the civilized back and forth dialogue about other things seen in the entire series. I think Weisman's Dr. No is arguably the best villain of the series and is one of the most impactful, even though he has very limited screen time. His presence is there and magnified throughout the entire film before he's ever seen. It should also be said that the version of Honey Ryder in the film is excellent and, of course, iconic for Ursula Andress's performance and appearing in the famous white bikini. But if I did have a criticism about the adaptation, is that a good deal of the tenacity of the Honey Ryder character from the novel is sacrificed. She is in the film much more of an innocent, and while she does still assist Bond and Quarrel and help keep them away from Dr. No's guards, she doesn't have the wherewithal of the Fleming version. And while Bond is still protective towards her, it doesn't have that same level of romantic attachment between the two. It's much more of an on-the-surface attraction, which is fine for the film, and there's less time to play with in terms of a shorter film versus a novel. But if I did have any major criticism of the film, it's that we do lose quite a bit of the strength of the Honey Ryder character. Although, thankfully, her backstory is retained, and we do get the scene of her telling Bond about how she dispatched her rapist, which for a 1962 film is a really striking moment, and one of the moments I like to point to when people try to write off the women of the Bond films in terms of the lead heroines as being merely, decorative or things like that. And all you have to do is look at that scene in a 1962 film and say, well, where else were you going to find that in a major 1962 film being discussed of a woman getting revenge and killing her rapist and taking great pleasure in doing so? It's one of the great dramatic moments of both the novel and the film. So I'm glad that was replicated, but it's just a shame that we didn't have more of that grittiness that's in the Honey character in the novel. But otherwise, I think it's a brilliant adaptation that manages to highlight all of the great strengths of the story and do it all for a very low budget. It has to be stressed how amazing Ken Adams' production design is for fully realizing what Fleming put down on the page and also going into the stratosphere of imagination for the first time with the inner workings of Dr. No's fortress, which, considering the budget he had to work with, is absolutely magical. It's quite possibly his best work on the Bond series, considering the incredibly low budget he had to work with for not just designing the Dr. No section in terms of the fortress, but all of the film is beautifully designed. But last, I want to highlight what is probably the greatest contribution the film makes to the story, which is actually in the Jamaica section towards the middle, where we have the subplots with the various attempts that are made on Bond's life and the thwarting of Dr. No's agents. This does take away from the time spent with Quarrel in the novel, but it does keep the focus on James Bond as a character. And this is what builds to the sequence in Miss Taro's cottage, which is entirely invented for the film and is the other truly great dramatic moment in the film and one of the great moments in the series, building up to the killing and dispatching of Professor Dent. It's also nice that the film introduces the idea that Dr. No's agents reach higher up in society and are not merely in the Chinese community, that he has eyes and ears and fingers everywhere. So most people will point to the cold-blooded killing of Professor Dent as one of the signature moments in the series, which is true, but I think the whole sequence, and particularly the two scenes that precede it, Bond's tryst with Miss Taro, knowing that he's merely killing time, and then especially Bond's waiting and staging of the apartment while waiting for the agent of Dr. No to show up and attempt to assassinate Bond himself. That is one of the key dramatic moments that explains everything about Bond's character with practically no dialogue. It is a masterclass in suspense writing and in delaying the payoff to the moment of absolute breaking point, and doing so with a cold-blooded, sardonic quality that picks up on those same elements in Fleming. It's a sequence that's so amazing that you wish it was in the novel, and it feels as if it's of the novel, but it's a perfect distillation of everything that's in the James Bond character and in the novels in one particular sequence. And so if I had to highlight any particular element of the film that was invented and not in the actual original novel, it is that sequence, which is one of the great moments in the entire series. After 1962, there are at least a couple other films in the EON series that either reference Dr. No elements or have a few little moments that are similar to moments from the novel. Now, Live and Let Die as a film was made as the 8th James Bond film in 1973. Since the films never adapted the books in chronological order, this meant that the earlier book that took place in Jamaica and introduced the Quarrel and Strangways characters was adapted afterwards. And on top of that, Live and Let Die as a film was designed around launching Roger Moore in the role of James Bond, and rather adroitly uses some of the structure of Dr. No, the film. And of course, the film Live and Let Die has a significant portion set in the Caribbean. It was actually shot in Jamaica, but they just changed it to the island of San Monique in the film. But if you actually look at the film Live and Let Die, it is very similar in ways to Dr. No, the film, and has elements of course, the Dr. No novel, as both the novels Live and Let Die and Dr. No have a lot of echoes. But the film has to tweak a number of things, such as the character of Quarrel Jr. being invented to replace the original Quarrel. So it's an interesting example of having to work backwards, because the earlier novel set in Jamaica was adapted as the 8th film, and that film actually does incorporate some elements of the Dr. No film adaptation. So again, it's having to kind of work backwards. There's a couple moments from the novel that are transposed into other elements in the film adaptation, and also may have been used for other moments for other films. So when you look at things such as the famous scene in the Dr. No film of the voice of Dr. No coming from the ceiling telling Professor Dent to pick up the tarantula, one could think of that as an extension or a transformed version of Bond at the start of the obstacle course and being guided along by disembodied voices coming through speaker grills. Also, the tarantula in the film that's in Bond's bed that takes the place of the centipede from the novel is, of course, basically taking the idea of Bond having to crawl through the giant nest of tarantulas in the obstacle course. The dead wardens looking after the roseate spoonbills kind of are transformed into Honey Ryder's dead marine biologist father, killed by Dr. No ostensibly. And then, of course, the poisoned fruit in Bond's hotel room is sort of replaced by the radioactive samples that Bond has to test. So in both versions of the Dr. No story, there's something that Bond has to get tested that's tied to Dr. No, but the film goes for the more attention-grabbing radioactive samples as opposed to the book having the basket of poisoned fruit. Two moments that do reflect other Eon Bond films, whether consciously or unconsciously. One I think may have been very conscious, actually, is when you look at Diamonds Are Forever and how that film gets rid of Blofeld, ostensibly, with Bond taking over a crane that was lifting Blofeld in his bathosub, and then using said bathosub to smash into the control room and ruin the satellite link and thus save the day and kill Blofeld in the process, or so it seemed. This seems like it could have been lifted somewhat from Bond taking over the crane at the end of the Dr. No novel and dispatching Dr. No using his own machinery. It's not, of course, exactly the same, but once you start to think about it, if that sequence in the novel sounds familiar to fans of the film series, it does make you wonder whether Tom Mankiewicz and Richard Maybaum were perhaps consciously referencing on a particular point that hadn't been adapted for one of the films, which is something that the screenwriters would have to do continuously and just mine for elements that hadn't been used. Then another very small moment that may be unintentional, but in A View to a Kill, when Bond and Stacey Sutton are infiltrating the main strike mine, they get miners' uniforms, and Stacey has to obviously wear a uniform that's much too big for her and kind of roll up the sleeves and stuff. And this is actually reminiscent of Bond and Honey trying to escape from Dr. No's fortress on Crab Key and having to disguise themselves, but there's not a uniform that will fit Honey as they're trying to escape the guards in their last sort of journey out of Dr. No's guano factory. Now, there was also a 1962 comic adaptation of the story done to tie in with the release of the film. In England, it was done as part of the Classics Illustrated series and is a serviceable adaptation of the film version of the story. But then it was also published in America by DC Comics as part of their Showcase series. This is the exact same overall basic comic, but rather interestingly, it was censored and tweaked for the American market. So some of the language was censored or tamed down, but then also all other ethnicity was pretty much removed. So that means all the characters in the story pretty much are all primarily Caucasian, including Quarrel. So it's a very bizarre reading experience. It's a very limited comic adaptation, but for what it is, especially at the time, and for a comic adaptation of a movie that was not a proven commodity yet and was not really marketed very well and kind of came and went, it's better than you'd expect it to be. But it's also a very rare comic to find. Particularly the USDC version is a real collector's item, but you can find versions online or at least look at the art. But the British version is overall the better edition because it didn't have the censoring and various tweaks applied to it. But there was technically this other adaptation of Dr. No done in comic form to tie into the film's release. Surprisingly, Dr. No was adapted for the children's market as a read-along book and record set from Kid Stuff Records in 1985. 4 of the Eon James Bond films, including A View to a Kill, were adapted in this way. Dr. No sees the story condensed down to about 14 minutes as to fit on 2 sides of a record, and then a short book with the classic turn the page when you hear this sound. All of the major story beats are here, but everything is condensed down to an extreme degree. Essentially, Bond is sent to Jamaica to find out who is doing the toppling of missiles, is taken away by Mr. Jones in the car, and then very quickly that is mashed together with the later car chase, and Bond escapes the car going off the cliff, then immediately goes to Crab Key, and we have a version of the hiding from the dogs and fighting the dragon. Then he's captured and meets with Dr. No, and after Bond is led away, he fights Chang and gets into the control room where we have the final fight between Bond and Dr. No. And interestingly, Dr. No is not actually killed. It just says he's rendered unconscious, lest you forget this is an adaptation for children of Dr. No. So there is no Honey Ryder and no Quarrel in this story. There's not even Felix Leiter. This is an extraordinarily streamlined adaptation that takes a little getting used to because it is a version made for children reduced to under 15 minutes in length. But for what it is, it's actually surprisingly effective. The rendering of James Bond isn't always necessarily the typical James Bond we expect. At one point he even says the phrase holy mackerel, which is not really a thing you ever expect James Bond to say, but overall it's actually a surprisingly solid adaptation for what it is and the extreme parameters, and you do at least get a sense of Bond as a character, even if all of the elements of the story have been ridiculously oversimplified. The only real issue with this adaptation is that it's entirely set to background music that's also quite loud, and most of it resembles, I suppose the best way to describe it is it usually resembles over-dramatic music from a cartoon of the 1980s. And so it really dates this. It's also rather amusing in a way because the music is so overbearing in places, but it also makes this almost a precursor to what would eventually be tried out with the James Bond Jr. cartoon series. So this is a fascinating sort of look into the James Bond character and Dr. No in particular as reworked completely for children. Lastly, there is the BBC radio drama adaptation, which is part of the same overall series starring Toby Stephens as James Bond. This is a really good adaptation of the novel overall, as it has to squeeze everything down into a short span of time, and of course using only audio. I do enjoy listening to these radio drama adaptations, and I think Toby Stephens makes for a really great radio Bond in terms of a radio version of Fleming's Bond. As with some of the other adaptations, they do have to leave out quite a bit of even iconic moments of the book simply due to the time frame that they have. And also some moments don't necessarily translate into audio only. But it is a very good adaptation with, some moments that might be a little bit questionable in terms of, why would they leave this out but then keep this? Thankfully, there's not any major moments of the attempts at sort of inserted new humor that were done in some of the other adaptations. And I think overall, it's one of the better or best of this series, as Dr. No is a much simpler, more straightforward story and sort of lends itself more to being adapted into another medium. However, there is one major element that is unfortunately something that I don't think works at all. This is the same sort of problem I had with the Diamonds Are Forever radio adaptation, which took a completely different approach in how the main villain Seraphimo Spang was personified and basically ruined Fleming's character in that version. Here, the performance of Dr. No is actually done by David Suchet, who's of course famous for his performance of Poirot. But the particular take and approach that's done with Fleming's Dr. No in this radio adaptation just, for me, doesn't work, and it just feels completely out of place and is not something I expected. It makes the issue I had with the version of Seraphimo Spang in the radio Diamonds Are Forever look like nothing, because Dr. No is a much bigger villain with more dialogue and more time spent with them, and the whole story builds up to the reveal of Dr. No. And while we still have the same scenes, it's really the performance and the voice and the affectations and just the style that really feels off-putting and weird. I can understand they were going for something maybe a bit otherworldly, but it does not work when the main Bond villain and one of Fleming's best villains suddenly makes his appearance, and of course it's audio only, so voice really matters. It's the famous scene of looking at the aquarium and then the dinner scene, and Dr. No sounds like this. "You have put me to a great deal of trouble. Now I intend to put you to a great deal of pain, Mr. Bond." I'm not exaggerating. It's kind of like that every time Dr. No's in the story. I mean, it's a fine performance for what it is, and I love David Suchet and other things, but it just didn't work for me, and it felt really off kilter, like in a not good way. It's just, yeah, that really marred the overall experience. That's what they did with one of Fleming's best villains from the Bond novels. I mean, it's still obviously Dr. No, and everything else still works, and it's a fine adaptation, although it makes some questionable choices with what it leaves and retains from the story. But the particular approach they took for Dr. No's characterization, especially in the voice, it really does not fit. So, especially if you have Joseph Weisman's voice in your head and his beautiful, controlled performance, this is not that. It's quite a bizarre choice that, for me, did mar the experience of what is otherwise, I think, one of the best of the radio adaptations so far, and a fine adaptation of the novel. Now, to talk about the cover artwork and designs of some of the various editions of Dr. No over the years, we of course start with the Jonathan Cape UK first edition from 1958, which has the iconic cover of seemingly Honey Ryder in silhouette and a beautiful, ominous quality due to just how dark everything is, and the black and brown of the background almost blending together into what looks like perhaps ash or something, with Fleming's credit and the Dr. No title having a sort of etched in, handwritten effect. I've always loved this cover, even though I'm not exactly sure what it's supposed to be depicting. I'm thinking perhaps it's supposed to be Bond discovering Honey Ryder on the beach, completely nude, and that's why she's, of course, in silhouette here on the cover. But it just has a wonderful quality of feeling ominous while also giving you the sort of natural world flavor that the story has throughout all of the Crab Key sequences. So it's fitting that the cover would incorporate the Crab Key location in some form. But this is one of the most evocative and mysterious of all of the classic James Bond covers, and it's been one of my favorites since I was a kid. I don't know exactly how to explain the cover image or what exactly it's supposed to be depicting, but that's part of why I like it so much, that it has this quality of mystery and an ominous touch to it. In the US, we once again had a completely different cover artwork, which is more outwardly striking in terms of its attention-grabbing appearance. So the 1958 Macmillan first edition here in the US actually has a version of what looks like Dr. No coming into the chamber for the first time, and also a version of the giant squid with, of course, gleaming red eyes underwater, which is rendered in black to go with the black background, and then a very stylized Dr. No title, which immediately fits in with the book's classical pulp fiction aesthetic. So in terms of all of the cover artwork designs, the pulpiest and the one that thus fits the feel of the book most closely is probably this Macmillan first edition. So this is another of the US first edition covers with unique artwork that actually does rival and in some ways is actually more fitting than the iconic British artwork. So I think there's a number of great American first edition Bond covers, and this is certainly one of them that still stands as one of the best covers, as it has a nice usage of color, great attention-grabbing imagery, and perfectly fits the novel. In terms of the paperbacks, we have the 1958 original UK Great Pan in their James Bond series with a beautiful illustration of Bond and Honey Ryder with the villainous Dr. No looming large over behind them, and of course he is rendered in green to make him look even more otherworldly and menacing. This is beautiful and highly detailed, showing Bond and Honey struggling to escape the clutches of Dr. No in the swamps. This was later tweaked for the 1961 Pan reissue, which basically takes the same concept but puts it in the slightly updated Pan style with the bar and a Bond-like figure on the bottom, thus making the artwork smaller. And so we still have a green-tinged Dr. No menacing Bond and Honey trying to escape, but it's, of course, much smaller and less detailed than the first version. The first US paperback was done by Signet in 1958 in their style of emerging Bond paperbacks. So this has all of the title and author information in larger text taking up most of the cover, but we still have a beautiful rendering of Honey Ryder, complete with knife, trying to escape the clutches of Dr. No. So it's got a nice pulp adventure aesthetic and is attention-grabbing in terms of the lovely illustration and the usage of color. It's just not quite as iconic as some of the other paperbacks. For me, the iconic version of the book I think of and always reread and have had since childhood is the 1962 version done by Signet, first as a movie tie-in, but in their iconic James Bond thriller run of paperbacks in the 1960s. And Dr. No has a really striking black background for its cover, so it makes the book stick out with the usage of color standing out on the black background, and we have wonderful Barry Phillips artwork tucked in between Fleming's credit and the title, and there's always been something evocative about how good these paintings are, but they're so small on the cover that it draws your attention more. You almost find yourself putting it in front of your face to really scrutinize the artwork. And here it's, of course, very suggestive as the art stops right at the title just before we see more of Honey in the nude, ostensibly. So it's one of my favorite of the Signet covers of this series, and it did start as the movie tie-in, but then quickly transitioned into just the standard version. In the UK, Pan updated their version to have movie artwork as the movie tie-in edition. So this uses stills of Sean Connery and Ursula Andress with a nice sort of tinting done to them to have some attention-grabbing color on the cover, and has the first classic version of the 007 logo on the bottom. So it's basically changing out the artwork from the previous 1961 paperback, but updating everything to have movie-specific imagery. Both Pan and Signet would just change over to using previous versions of the paperbacks once the movie had been out, but removing all of the movie imagery and blurbs. So the Pan version transitioned over into their updated series to match the others with the second cover artwork, whereas the Signet edition became the standard black cover version without the little blurb about there now being a feature film adaptation. In 1965, Pan came out with their updated version of Dr. No with the sort of item cover series, which has a spider's web, which immediately makes the reader think of the nest of tarantulas, and it makes people who only know the film think of the tarantula in Bond's bed. While it's not maybe the image I would have gone with as a singular sort of image to represent all of Dr. No, it is good and ominous enough, and there's something about it being on this sort of disembodied blue background that makes it just a little bit more ominous. So I've actually always liked this cover, even though on the surface it's actually quite simple. In 1972, Pan did a version in their white cover with a lovely girl on the front, but here it's nice that it does look like a version of Honey Ryder. Of course, she's in the white bikini that's, of course, what we saw in the film, but still, it's a really nice, striking cover with enough pulp flavor to it, and it's nice that we actually have the character from the book actually on the cover, as frequently Bond covers, when they have beautiful women on them, it's not always necessarily representing the female characters of the book itself. Bantam had taken over the book publication in the US as part of their short-lived series, so we got the 1972 Bantam edition with the beautiful artwork by James Bama, who did all of Bantam's Bond covers, which sadly only included a few of Fleming's novels and the first continuation novel, Colonel's Son. All of these feature gorgeous imagery, beautiful likenesses, and the Fleming novels all feature a particular color background and beautiful artwork, but it is still sadly obscured by the oversized James Bond logo running down the side. So while these are some of my favorite covers and highly collectible, you do have to deal with the fact that the beautiful artwork is somewhat obscured, and these paperbacks themselves were not in print very long, so they're not the most common of US paperbacks. It's very difficult to actually find these in good shape now, and this is one of the ones I'd still like to find for my own collection because I really love the look of these outside of the big logo obscuring the art. In 1974, Pan came out with their next paperback as part of their sort of collection of items series, where they had perfectly staged photographs used for the covers that all had items or objects that specifically were used or were referencing elements of the story. Here for Dr. No, I think we have one of the best ones in that we have the 3 canes, the 3 silenced pistols, and the cup used by the 3 blind mice in the opening to assassinate Strangways, in addition to the bottle of perfume and the soap suds that indicate it's referencing the moment where Honey Ryder takes a bath in the mink-lined prison she and Bond find herself in, and Bond is drawing the bath for her. And there's also a photo of what looks like what could be Honey Ryder on top of what is a seashell starting to poke out. So this is perfectly representing moments and characters and specific items from the novel, and it's just one of the covers in this series that I really enjoy. Plus, the composition on all of these photos is always really well done. They definitely took a lot of time in staging and putting these together, and it was done by people who actually very clearly knew the books down to these minute details. Then comes what is one of the wildest looking James Bond covers, and that's the cover for the 1977 British edition done by Hutchinson, which apparently was done for young adult readers. And this goes for a complete fantasy adventure vibe with an actual dragon on the cover breathing fire in what looks like a forest, and then what is a nearly nude Bond and Honey running away. And so this looks more like a pulp cover for an Edgar Rice Burroughs story, or Journey to the Center of the Earth, or something dealing with a prehistoric fantasy story. So this is really out there. It's definitely is one of the covers that takes the most creative liberties with a Bond novel that I've ever seen, but there's something incredibly charming about just how over the top and slightly wacky this is. It's beautifully done for what it is. It's of course not the novel at all, but yeah, it's really has a winged fire-breathing dragon on it. So yeah, they took that literally in this cover. In 1978, we got the paperback version of the novel in what is known as the Girls on Guns cover, where we have various female figures draped over giant golden pistols. Here, there's a beautiful woman, but she's obviously not Honey Ryder, and I'm not sure exactly why people thought these kind of generic images would fit every Bond novel, but it is part of a series, and at least they did all of them in the same way, but that's what you have to expect with these particular printings. In the US, Jove took over the books and did a short-lived series with what I always sort of term very almost comic book style artwork, or sort of a mixture between comic book art and men's adventure paperbacks. This has a very straightforward adaptation of some elements of the novel, and is a pretty good cover, even though it may be a little bit inherently generic in ways. We've got a version of Bond carrying Honey Ryder with a bunch of sharks in the background, and the figure of Dr. No pointing ominously in white robes behind him. So it's definitely a bit on the generic side, but, we do have Bond carrying Honey and Dr. No on the cover and a bunch of sharks, and nice physique in terms of the artwork, even if the version of Bond looks quite generic and not like any of the typical Bond images or even any of the film actors. So I like this for what it is. It's not my favorite Bond cover, but it's well done. And like all of the covers in this short-lived run of the books, is actually quite good and not often discussed. Next would come the US paperbacks by Berkley and Charter in the mid-80s, done to go along with the John Gardner continuation books that had started with License Renewed in 1981. They did publish most of the Fleming novels in updated versions with covers and typeface to match the John Gardner paperbacks. So all of these have the generic standardized background of a bold color choice, then the standardized Ian Fleming's Master Spy James Bond placed somewhere in the upper to mid section of the cover, with the title on the bottom and another bold color choice, and then a various sort of generic action with gun pose of a Bond in silhouette. So if you put all of the American 1980s Berkley Charter paperbacks together for both the Fleming novel reprints and the then current John Gardner novels, they form a nice matching set. While these are, in their own ways quite generic, there's a certain charm to them, and I've always enjoyed looking at these, even though there shouldn't be anything attention-grabbing to them, really. There's just something about this overall aesthetic that I've always liked. It may be because I grew up finding these, but the actual Fleming reprints in this series are not all that common. I only have a few myself, and usually when you find them, they're, in pretty rough shape. Some are harder to find than others, so they only apparently printed more limited print runs for some of the novels, with Moonraker being the rarest to find in this version. But this is basically the version of the novel that was then available in the 80s in the US. In the US, we did actually have one more edition in the 1990s, which otherwise didn't see much for the Fleming novels, which had quietly gone out of print after the Berkley Charter paperbacks of the 80s. So we saw a release of Dr. No in the short-lived James Bond Classic Library edition, with the very stylized, almost cartoonish-looking artwork, always depicting a scene or elements of the novels. And here they just went right for it. We have James Bond fighting the giant squid at the end of Dr. No's obstacle course on the cover, well done in the style that this series used. Bond's hanging on the wire fence. He's got the tentacles wrapped around him, and all he has is the knife that he stole from the earlier dinner, and he's stripped to the waist. And we have a beautiful sort of amber orange glow as this is taking place at the break of dawn in the novel. It is beautifully done for the style and aesthetic of what these covers have, and we even have the eye of the giant squid reflecting up from the depths. And for this particular series, this is one of the best covers, and it's one of the few, if not really the only time, that a publisher decided, you know what, screw it, we're doing the giant squid battle for the cover, and if that doesn't get somebody to pick up this book and want to read it, nothing will. So that's a reason why I think this cover is so important, and why this edition is so nice to have in your collection, because somebody finally put the giant squid battle right on the cover and did a really great job of depicting it exactly as it's described. In the UK, Cornet Books did two different cover art designs in their new series aesthetic. One is, of course, what looks like Honey Ryder's hand gripping her hunting knife, dripping with water as she would have pulled it when first seeing Bond and having just emerged from the ocean. So it's actually a really great replication of a moment from the book with a really extraordinarily detailed artist rendering. So I really do like this cover, even though at first it might seem a little bit generic. The second is featuring a spider at the center, obviously meant to reference the 1960s Pan paperback with the spider's web, and of course reference the tarantula from the book. But of the two, I do think the cover with Honey Ryder gripping her hunting knife in close-up detail is the better option. In 2002, we got the incredible Richie Fahey cover as part of the Penguin series. This goes for full pulp aesthetics with a perfect rendering of Dr. No as he's described in the novel by Fleming, with the features being both recognizable and alien at the same time. We have a beautiful rendering of Honey Ryder gripping her hunting knife exactly as she's described in the book as being actually nude, so they actually were able to finally get that on a cover and not have it in silhouette or something, but it's perfectly staged to not have any full nudity on the cover. We have the roseate spoonbills actually make it onto the cover, so the bird theme is here, in addition to having more birds on the bottom, having the theme on the cover of also the guano factory, and we get a glimpse of Crab Key behind Honey here. The usage of having color in full on the image of Honey Ryder and then everything else in a sort of tinge of blue is a really attention-grabbing move that makes this, I think, one of the best covers in this series, which overall is one of the best series of Bond cover artworks that we've ever seen. And the only problem is that these are not still in print, so these are now all becoming collector's items, and I wish they were still the versions in print because these are phenomenally well done, and this one is one of my favorites in the whole run. In the UK, Penguin would do a variety of other covers. We have the 2002 version, which is part of their sort of generic shape series. I never know what to call these, but each of these have at least a splash of color and a stylized version of Fleming's credit and the title, but they always have some sort of generic or odd shape. But at least for Dr. No, these circles almost start to look like a tunnel, so I guess this is meant to perhaps reference Bond crawling through the tunnels of the obstacle course, and also with it being red, it might be supposedly referencing the machinery and radar and other equipment that Dr. No is using to mess with the American missile program. This is one of the covers in this series that actually kind of sort of works, I guess, although you're really kind of having to stare at it to figure out what it may be doing or referencing. Penguin would also use film stills for later paperbacks, so in their Modern Classic series, they just use one of the production stills of Ursula Andress. So this works, but I've always kind of felt it was cheating using random film stills and really just candid production stills. They did do this on a couple of the Penguin Modern Classic paperbacks around this time period, and they're always using images of the Eon Film. So these are okay, but it is kind of cheating just using a still of Ursula Andress, but it is a still of Ursula Andress on a book. So at least it's still a great cover, but again, it doesn't really suggest the novel. In 2009, we got the series of covers with beautiful Michael Gilette paintings, and this is one of the ones that actually does have the heroine of the book depicted on the cover. It's a beautiful painting of Honey Ryder, who is depicted nude as she is in the novel, and all of these covers, the conceit was that the female figure would be mostly nude, and the title and Fleming's credit would actually be on their bodies in a way. I guess to replicate the effect of the iconic Robert Brownjohn titles done for From Russia with Love and Goldfinger in their title sequences. I really love these covers, and the whole series with the Gillette artwork has become quite collectible, and now you have to pay quite a bit to get a whole set of these. But of them, this one may be my favorite one because it's actually directly the heroine of the novel being depicted. It's a really good likeness of how I sort of picture Honey Ryder from the novel, and we've also got the great detail of having the belt with the knife on it. Then to go the opposite way into unfortunately generic territory, we've got the vintage release from 2012, which is done in the same style as the other books they did in this way of using what looks like a photoshopped image of putting a male figure into what looks like a pre-existing stock photo. So I guess this is supposed to be Bond on the beach at Crab Key, but it's very generic and it's in black and white with only the title having a sort of off gold color. All of the covers that were done like this have this same sort of unfortunate generic quality, but at least it is suggesting the novel, which not every cover does, and Unfortunately, it only kind of gets worse from this point in terms of most of the covers. So while this is super generic, it's nowhere near as bad as it could be. Vintage would also do another edition in around this time period, and their sort of color stylized paperbacks and the vintage 007 line. So here we have a black background with just a stylized Dr. No, except the no is drawn out to then be distorted and reach the bottom of the cover. So it's attention grabbing, yes, but it also looks kind of silly at the same time. So I can get what they were going for, and it kind of works, but there's also no other imagery on the cover, so it's also kind of inherently generic. It's not the best of this run in terms of the others in the vintage 007 series, but it's at least serviceable. It just the way they drew the word no out just unfortunately kind of looks a little bit on the silly side. In 2012, we got the Thomas and Mercer edition, which is done in a uniform black, white, and red aesthetic to match all of the other books in the series. And here, all they did really was just do a very tall, stylized Dr. No title with the 007 in a red circle that is done on all of these. This is a very simple cover. It's okay. It's actually one of the better of this series for being a bit more plain. Some of the covers in the Thomas and Mercer series do leave a lot to be desired, and also will incorporate various shapes and other things that seem quite generic or kind of odd or ill-fitting for the actual book in question. So I do like what they did with the Dr. No title, and for a cover, it's okay, actually, but I've never been a big fan of this particular run of the books, but for what it is, it's solid and okay. In 2018, Vintage did a limited reprinting as part of a specially branded series looking at villains, and we got this stylized version of the Dr. No title yet again on a white background, except here, they use a whole quote from the book, "You're out of luck, Dr. No," and then the no is in a sort of lavender color, and I'm kind of curious as to what their overall approach or goal was with this, because, you know, yes, that's a sort of classical adventure hero line, but also it just kind of looks weird on a book cover stylized like this, and there being nothing else on the cover. It kind of looks like something you'd expect more on a novel of another genre than a James Bond novel. So it just feels kind of odd to me, but it does go with the overall aesthetic they were doing for this particular series of various books that were chosen. Then in 2023, we got the first release of the novel from Ian Fleming Publications, who had taken over publication of the Bond novels in the UK and other territories. They did this stylized 007 cover aesthetic for all of these new printings, and each of the books will feature some aspect of the actual story. So here we have what looks like the roseate spoonbill in the waters around Crab Key, which looks like it's appearing in the background. This is an okay cover. It has nice color. It fits the overall aesthetic, but it also seems rather generic. It's not as attention-grabbing as other covers, and obviously it doesn't hold up against the beautiful 2002 Penguin version, which also had the roseate spoonbills. But, you know, for what it is, it's okay. But the other issue is that this is the first release of the edited and censored text, as the Fleming estate did employ sensitivity readers and made various tweaks and changes to most, if not all, of the Bond novels. Each book from this point forward carries a blanket statement that certain changes have been made to the original text, although the reader is never exactly told what those changes actually were. There's never been any confirmation of every change they made, and while they are small, it is a practice I don't agree with, although it obviously has the best intentions. So I do think it is important to know this going forward and to avoid all modern editions that carry a censored and altered text. Now, this also goes for the American edition done by an imprint of Harper Collins and is done in the same uniform cover design as all the others in this series, which is without question the most generic and zero effort covers we've ever seen for the Bond novels. Here we have Fleming's credit and the title in a sort of purple, and then in the 007 logo, we just have generic stock images of palm trees on an island. Nothing specifically from the novel, just yet another generic stock image. And on top of that, this also features the censored and altered text, and as a paperback printing is on the cheaper and flimsier side when you actually get to hold these in your hand and look at them in bookstores. So I'm not a fan at all of this current HarperCollins reissue paperback series of the novels, and I also feel that they are completely useless as they are not the original text as written by Fleming. They are still the censored and slightly tweaked versions, which again, I understand why the estate wanted to do that, but I do think it was the wrong move and should not be supported. However, if you want a current in-print edition that features Fleming's original text, you do have the option of picking up the beautiful Folio Society edition. These are all limited and beautifully illustrated with exclusive hardbox slipcovers, but of course they are collector's items and meant for the serious literary collector and feature substantial price tags. Currently, this is retailing for $80 US from the Folio Society website, but you do get a beautiful archival edition with the original text and gorgeous artworks illustrating moments throughout by Faye Dalton, who did a lot of the other books in the series, so they're all part of a matching set. So at present, this is the most premium option you have for getting a copy of the novel, and the only way you can actually purchase a brand new edition with the original unaltered text. There's also a new hardcover edition from IFP directly with brand new Michael Gilette artwork, who did the covers for this whole series. There's a rough sort of uniform matching aesthetic, so all the covers go together, and each one is a hardcover edition with some bonus material that seems to be a Fleming letter or two included. For Dr. No, there is a stylized mechanical hand holding what looks like the spider on a string, so it does suggest Dr. No being behind all of the attempts to kill Bond. It does suggest elements of the story, although you don't have spiders until the tunnel sequence, so it would have been more fitting to the book to have the Centipede on the cover, which I don't think has ever been represented. But overall, this is a good-looking cover. It has beautiful composition, beautiful images, nice color, and has the matching aesthetic to the others in this series. Unfortunately, even though this is being marketed and sold as a collector's edition, this does feature the edited and censored text, which makes it useless, as it is not the original text that Fleming wrote and was originally published in 1958. Now, to talk about editions in my own collection, I have a few going back to my childhood copy of the classic Signet edition. This is obviously the worse for wear and a much later printing, as it's already added the 007 Pages logo, but this obviously has some spine damage and the cover is barely hanging on. I've just held on to this because it was my childhood copy, but I do have a slightly better condition reading copy from around the same era, so it's got the edition of the 007 in the Pages logo, which was added to later Signet printings. And of course, the other signifier is that the Fleming credit on the back is updated with the later photo and updated to have Fleming's death included. So that's always how you can tell you've got a later Signet printing from after 1964. So this has the iconic Barry Phillips artwork with the black background, and I've always felt this is one of the most bold and striking of the Signet covers. We, of course, have the matching spine with the title on white and the iconic red-edged pages of the Signet. Then, of course, the title page and the opening. I've also got the American Berkley paperback edition from the mid-'80s. So again, this done in the same style to match the John Gardner paperbacks of the '80s. This with a off orange background, which was used on a number of the Fleming reprints, and it's in pretty solid shape. Again, usually when you find these, they're pretty worn by now, and the actual Fleming reprints are, few and far between. You typically find some of them, but others were not done, apparently in very big print runs. but in terms of the text and layout, it's done in the same style as the John Gardner paperbacks, and it is done in a more easier on the eyes or more readable font. So that's another attraction of these, that all of the Berkley 80s US paperbacks, including the Fleming reprints, have this very easy to read font that's obviously a bit bigger, and I've always enjoyed the readability factor of the 80s paperbacks. I, of course, have the wonderful James Bond Classic Library Edition from the early to mid 1990s from MJF Books, with the fantastic rendition of the giant squid battle. That alone makes this possibly my favorite of this whole run in terms of the classic library hardcovers. Now, these were only done in hardcover, and they only did some of the Fleming novels, so you can get mostly a complete set in these nice attention-grabbing hardcovers that are getting harder to find, but they're still not terribly expensive. And if you were to get any of them, I'd say Dr. No would be the one to start with, because they've actually done the giant squid battle on the cover. And actually seeing it in person, I think, does it better justice, because the attention to detail is quite good. Again, it's really depicting the scene from the book. You can even see the suckers on the actual tentacles. And even though it's got this very cartoonish sort of aesthetic to the art, like all the books in this series, it's really well done. And we've even got the depiction of the breaking dawn as well. And it's got a little bit of a wraparound effect onto the spine, but sadly, the back is the same generic white cover as we see on all of these. So you get just a teensy bit of a wraparound effect, which does make it pretty nice. It's just a shame the back is generic on all of these. You slip off the dust jacket to reveal a nice yellow and white book underneath in terms of the boards, and we get the title in gold, nicely stylized with the James Bond Classic Library logo as well, and it's actually embossed with texture on the spine, which is a nice touch. In terms of size and the overall text and things, it looks rather similar to the US 1960s book club editions with the girls and guns on the covers. But it's actually quite nice to have this as a hardcover edition if you're looking for an affordable hardcover edition of Dr. No that you can actually get and not pay through the nose for, and it's the original text, and it's got a really nice cover. So I do like these editions as sort of the recommended budget option for Bond collectors in the US who want a nice, striking hardcover edition that you can get a set of most of the Fleming novels at an affordable price in. But Dr. No is probably my favorite edition in this particular series. And then, of course, we have the 2002 paperback with the Richie Fahey artwork, which is just stunning. It's even better when you get it in your hands. Everything from the attention to detail of using elements from the books, the uses of color, the composition, the mixture of styles, and the stylization of the font, and an overall matching aesthetic to the other books in this series, plus having the matching spine with the logos and Fleming's credit, so all of the books on the shelf go together, and having a wraparound effect with the matching rear, which also has the same Bond holding gun image in the corner that's on all of the books as a unifying segment on even the rear covers. It's just an absolutely brilliant piece of graphic design and book design, and makes this overall Penguin series, I think, the one that everybody has to match and try and beat, and I don't think they will in terms of modern book editions. Plus, if you look at these in the lights, there's a slight photo finish on the actual imagery, which makes the actual covers even more premium feeling. The inside always has a stylized version of one of the famous Fleming photos. And then on the back, there's always a direct printing of just a standard but really nicely done 007 to conclude the book with, and always done to match the cover. So here it's done in a sort of ocean blue. So if you're looking to have an edition of the book that's maybe more modern, but an affordable copy with great artwork that features the original text, I think the 2002 Penguin series is the one to go for, but these are all long out of print and are now starting to go up in collectability pricing on the used market. The only issue with these is that because they're paperbacks from the 2000s, for various reasons, paperbacks obviously are not printed with as much quality or as high quality paper and ink as hardcover editions, so you do have to deal with some unfortunate foxing or page tanning. So when you look at these now, typically when you find used copies, you will notice that the pages have some degree of browning to them. Not anything major or terrible, but it means that getting copies in really good shape is getting increasingly difficult. But if you want really fantastic Bond editions, these are the modern copies to beat. I really wish these had never gone out of print, because I don't think anything has come close to matching the level of quality and care that was put into this particular run of the books. So overall, Ian Fleming's sixth James Bond novel, Dr. No from 1958, is, I think, still an incredible reading experience, even if you only know the film version and are coming to the book for the first time. While the film is extraordinarily faithful to the book and basically has the exact same plot, it doesn't have the same degree of atmosphere throughout, plus the film Bond is a very different animal to the literary Bond. And it's also important to consider Dr. No's placement coming just after From Russia with Love and dealing directly with the ending cliffhanger of that book and starting Bond off on a particular foot where he's not fully back up to speed and feels resentment towards himself and towards M on being put on this particular assignment as a sort of punishment in a way. Plus we have the iconic assignment of the Walther PPK for the first time in a Bond story, and a novel that returns to elements of Live and Let Die, echoing that book, and of course classical pulp fiction elements. There is another reason for that, and that is, of course, this story originally was generated when Fleming was tasked with developing a potential television series that was going to be called Commander Jamaica, the idea being that they would get Ian Fleming, writer of the James Bond novels and someone who lived in Jamaica part-time, to create a series of adventure stories around a particular operator, agent, detective figure whose home base was in Jamaica. When this series didn't come to fruition, apparently Fleming did take a lot of the concepts he had generated for various episodes and used them to generate the basis of the Dr. No novel. So this is something that Fleming would sort of return to time and time again in terms of generating ideas for maybe something non-Bond or a Bond side project, and then when that didn't come to fruition, he would transition those into his yearly novel. Of course, this would ultimately result in his using the Thunderball story treatment for his Thunderball novel, which he really shouldn't have done, and that led to the court case, which eventually had Kevin McClory get all rights to the Thunderball novel, the credits having to be updated to include McClory and Jack Whittingham's name, and of course McClory getting all rights to the Spectre Association. But here on Dr. No, all of the ideas and story treatments and scripts and things were all Fleming's for a series that never materialized. And since they were all done originally for short episodes, I think this maybe was the first time that Fleming started playing around with Bondian type concepts and shorter forms, which probably led him to eventually writing James Bond short stories. And eventually we'd see the first James Bond short story collection a short while later in For Your Eyes Only. So this is a novel that's actually important for a number of different reasons in terms of where it comes in the overall James Bond literary canon, what type of novel it is, how it originally got started as a side project, non-Bond related, and then how it, of course, echoes Live and Let Die naturally due to the Jamaica setting and being much more pulp action-adventure oriented, and being, along with Live and Let Die, the most out-and-out action-adventure of all of the James Bond novels. While it's not often discussed among the best of Bond novels when fans are doing comparisons or doing their rankings and such, I think it really deserves to be in the conversation. It's a book that I wind up admiring every time I reread it, as I do with all of Fleming's works, but in particular, Dr. No is one of the most totally effective of all of the Bond novels. It never lets up from start to finish. It's outstanding while also paying tribute to classical pulp fiction tropes and elements of all of the classic pulp works that Fleming himself grew up and devoured voraciously throughout his lifetime. And of course, the connections and parallels are right there to Sax Rohmer and Fu Manchu, and Fleming's basically wearing those on his sleeve. But as I said before, he was not simply going to regurgitate those. He had to do it his own way and put his own particular unique spin on it. And so, of all of the James Bond novels, this is the one that is the most classical pulp adventure throughout its story, perhaps even more so than Live and Let Die was. Never again would Fleming really do a pulp adventure through and through to this degree. The later Bond novels, of course, would retain the adventure elements that you need and all of the other elements of the character and the character's world established in the books, but from this point onward, especially with Goldfinger being a significantly longer novel and featuring an almost moodier Bond with even greater character introspection throughout, you got the sense that both Bond and Fleming were getting older and their viewpoints were shifting and changing, and also Fleming couldn't write the same books over and over again. He had to change and adapt with not only his experiences, but the world around him, and eventually also be dealing with his declining health playing a factor as well. So this is a sort of crossroads in a way for the literary James Bond in terms of style and themes and tone. It's as if Dr. No in a way is the time where Fleming put all of his adoration and love for classic pulp fiction works at its full intensity. And so after this, he started going down other pathways and trying other things with his character and where the series was going. So it makes, again, Dr. No a sort of transitional book in a way. And you can sort of look at the literary James Bond in terms of Fleming's novels as being separated into specific sections. Usually the first 5 books are kind of in their own sort of section. And so Dr. No is really the transitional book or the last of the out-and-out adventure-driven books. Then we transition over into the next period, starting with the novel Goldfinger. So as always, I hope my babblings about the world of James Bond, Ian Fleming, and the literary Bond have been at least somewhat fun and informative. All the videos in this series are an extension of my rereading process. I try to reread the Fleming novels and then all of the continuation Bond novels every so often. And so this is a fun sort of way to try and encapsulate the world of each novel and also put a fresh spin on things by doing a whole sort of video presentation after rereading the same book that you've loved for the 1000th time and just looking for a fresh way to approach it. So as always, please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully finding some lovely books to add to your James Bond collection. Keep reading print books, keep bonding, and as always, thank you ever so much for watching.